So my name is João Carlos Magalhães. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, and it's truly my pleasure to host today Robert Gorwa. So Rob Gorwa is a leading scholar in platform governance. Currently, he's a postdoctoral researcher at the Berlin Social Science Center. He's also a fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation. Rob studies the politics of technology policy, and I guess with a special interest in platform governance, as I said, but also emerging socio-technical regulatory arrangements in the digital economy. And I think his talk today about AI sort of connects with this other line of research. Hob Rhodes holds a DPhil from Oxford's Department of Politics and International Relations, and he's also the author of The Politics of Platform Regulation, How Governments Shape Online Content Moderation, which was published last year by Oxford University Press. Rob, thank you so much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wow. It's really wonderful to be here online with you. And I am sorry that I wasn't able to make it over in person to Manchester, a city that I really like. In particular, your brewery scene. Breweries like Track and Cloudwater. So anyway, hopefully can come back sometime soon. Joao, would you mind just confirming that these slides are sharing just fine? Yeah, you're muted, but okay. Thumbs up. Okay, great. In that case, I'll drive in. Yeah, so as Joao mentioned, I am a kind of slightly strange interdisciplinary policy scholar that has been working a lot on the question of social media content moderation and platform regulation. And I guess like many people who have been working in these spaces for a long time, I have been doing a bit of a AI pivot. I mean, not entirely, that's slightly tongue in cheek. I've been working on kind of automation and its role in content moderation for a long time. But for the first time in the last 16 months or so, I've been finding something interesting to look at and write about in the kind of AI space that, of course, has been blowing up so much in the last couple of years. That's something, I guess, that is at the kind of intersection of my work on platforms as governors, and also just feels like it's creating some kind of genuinely new and interesting regulatory challenges. So that's what I'm going to talk about mainly in this talk today. I'll tell you about some joint work that I've been doing with Michael Veale, who's a legal scholar at the University College London, UCL. Most of this talk will be about a paper that came out that you can find online now if you just want to flick through. It's called Moderating Model Marketplaces, Platform Governance Puzzles for AI Intermediaries. We presented at the FACT conference, and it's out in a UK law journal called Law, Innovation, Technology. And we are currently in the process of turning this paper into a bigger book. So I'll be interested in running some of the high-level arguments past you all here today and getting your feedback. So just very quickly, because I think it's often helpful when we're talking about AI, given just how capacious this term is and how pretty much all kinds of things and technologies seem to be coming under that umbrella recently. What I'm particularly interested about, and what we're particularly interested about in this work we've been doing together, is understanding the way that complex socio-technical systems, complex AI products and services, which, as we all know, are often talked about in this kind of black box, opaque, complex system metaphor, are actually products that are situated in complex networks or supply chains. So a lot of the tools that we use on a daily basis, and as I will discuss in this talk, a lot of tools that potential bad actors working online and offline are using in various ways. These products are kind of structured in these networks where production, deployment, and use get split across different actors that have to work together to put together functionality. So we've been thinking about this through the lens of a kind of stack of different actors at different levels, providing hardware, infrastructure, platforms, intermediary services, all sorts of different things, ranging from kind of compute providers that, of course, many of us are going to be familiar with, that are providing infrastructure for training, also increasingly hosting models and different types of infrastructure in the cloud. data brokers and other actors, both kind of public and private or hybrid consortium things like Lion, that are collecting and annotating and creating data that then is being used for AI training or for model fine-tuning. Similarly, there are labeling and annotation firms that kind of feed into these big data sets. Then you have the often called foundation model developers, which are the firms that maybe a lot of us are thinking about when we think about AI companies, the big players that are really making kind of governance decisions, shaping how these products work. But there's a second tier of other developers that I think are also quite interesting and a bit underexplored, players that create kind of fine-tuning packages and fine-tune big models, especially open source, or, that's a contentious term, but open models that have weights that can be then adapted by other people. And there's more. So this is something we'll talk about today. We've gotten really interested in these model hosting platforms. We call them model marketplaces. I'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. But these are intermediaries that make open source models or open weight models, as well as other data infrastructure available to other users in a way that they can interact with it and integrate them into their workflows. And increasingly, also AI is being run on local devices and local hardware. So Apple is, of course, becoming a player, but you can run models, often on your own domestic device, downloading models from places like Hugging Face and then running them locally if you have a decent, used to be a gaming laptop, but now most high-end laptops can run these things, and some phones now can too. So just one more kind of quick contextual slide as to the things that we're interested in, because of course, if you say, okay, I'm interested in AI governance and regulation, not only is AI incredibly capacious, but the question of what exactly is being governed and what the potential risks and harms that one is interested in is also unbelievably capacious. So there's one category which I'm just going to bracket and kind of not talk about at all. And we can maybe briefly discuss why I think this is not a major importance, not an important issue for digital trusts and security researchers to be worrying about right now. And that's where a lot of the kind of contemporary mainstream AI safety conversation is, which is really worrying about models that are basically going to acquire kind of superhuman capacities and have some kind of existential threat on the future of humanity. The second kind of type of risk and harm, which is really emerging in the interdisciplinary literature that's pushing back against this first literature, is the kind of socio-technical work that's more interested in the externalities of AI systems. And some might also object a little bit to this term, but what I mean by this is the things that happen that are kind of risks and harms that are undesirable, we would argue, from a lot of these models working exactly as they intended. So without them kind of going haywire, going off the rails, causing some kind of unforeseen, biological, chemical, whatever, other types of risks, these are the externalities when these models are used in the world based on the current AI development paradigm. So, of course, environmental issues are something that are getting a lot of attention right now. You could say labor issues, which also have been kind of robustly studied, including at the WTB here, where I am in Berlin, with the Fair Work Project, which looks at the often terrible working conditions of people who work in the gig economy and increasingly are being pulled into the pipeline of kind of data annotation, curation, content safety, these kinds of things, right? So these are kind of, the industry might say, unforeseen or undesirable but necessary impacts of the kind of AI revolution we're living through right now. And then there's a third type of harms, and this is the thing actually that we're the most interested in our book, and I think this maybe will resonate also with some of the work that you all are doing at the center, which is something that we'll call malicious AI. So this is people taking existing AI technologies or tools and doing stuff, bad human stuff with them, right? We might think about this as kind of bad people doing bad things with maybe bad AI. Things like fraud, impersonation, cyber attacks, child abuse imagery, spam, mis and disinformation, hate speech. all these things that we well know, and actually a sub kind of body of the critical research in AI safety inside some firms, and actually also the early research coming out of big research labs like DeepMind, which was really concerned about these types of issues. This is something that either is already happening a lot, will kind of continue to happen in the future, and can already happen with kind of mainstream LLMs, both open weight models and proprietary ones, as well as multimodal and image models. And also, as we write about a bit in our work, is something that is increasingly being pursued in a kind of more bespoke way by various malicious organizations and criminal organizations of various kinds, right? And this ranges from the kind of individual actor who is taking open models and using photos of ex-partners to fine-tune that model and create a model that creates realistic impersonations of a real person. Or it could range to, large scam enterprises that are building fraud or hate speech LLMs trained on corpuses of, for example, successful fraudulent interactions, fine-tuning open models, creating a kind of specific malicious pipeline. So the reason why we're interested in this is that we think that this kind of malicious AI use problem of bad people doing bad things with bad AI, if you will mobilize intermediaries to act. And actually, we argue and we show in this paper, they are already being mobilized to do so. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that we're talking about a system that is being used to run romance scams at scale. For those of you that like the London Review of Books, as I do, the latest issue has a very extensive discussion of a review of a book called or Scams, sorry, about the South Asian and kind of global crypto and other scam industry, something that historically has required an extraordinary amount of human labor and is now being automated in various ways. So if someone we're trying to run a kind of automated lead vetting and also then kind of target interaction pipeline for this kind of system, they are going to possibly involve a bunch of actors across the stack, right? So they might take an LLM that is from a foundation model developer, probably something that's open weights, like maybe Meta's Llama. That model might be distributed on a model marketplace. It could have already been fine-tuned into a kind of specific model designed for these kinds of scams and hosted on a model like this, or they could have done this themselves. They might fine-tune that either themselves locally or using a cloud computing service like Amazon Web Services or Azure. They might then take basically a snapshot, something like a LoRa for image models, which allows basically these kinds of fine-tuned models to be shared in a cheap and kind of computationally efficient way on another software repository or website. Someone else might then run that model locally, right? So they might have trained this model locally using Microsoft services, then deployed it on Microsoft, but Microsoft might have discontinued services to them. So then they run their own servers or they have their own computers running these models locally. And there's more. I mean, if we're really getting creative on this, they could be running this either on specialized servers that they've purchased or simply on kind of commercial grade hardware, laptops, new Apple M1 MacBooks, etc. They could be using various open source toolkits to kind of automate part of this pipeline, web GPUs and other things that can help them do this more efficiently. And then if they want, they could even start using kind of network intermediaries to live fine tune these as they kind of turn them on the world, right? So I don't want to digress too hard, but we've been thinking a little bit about the possibility of these things called RAGs, retrieval augmented generation, which are basically forms of kind of real-time web or database search that then feed into the context window of the model and are used to affect the inputs and outputs, right? And this is something that big firms like OpenAI are now using to make the models hallucinate less and be more useful. So for example, if a base model like GPT-5 was trained this year, and then a new iPhone comes out next year, it's incredibly annoying and expensive for them to constantly have to be retraining this model. So it's easier for them. What the firms are doing is they're running this search through a process called RAG in the background, and it is basically pulling the top sites. So, we write a little bit in our book about sites like iFixit, which are getting absolutely hammered by web crawlers from AI companies because, if Apple releases an iPhone next year, which doesn't have information in the training data, the model still wants to tell a user how to, for example, fix it, or at least give a somewhat grounded prediction as to how to fix this. So that's a bit of a long digression, but of course you could also, scammers could possibly do this. They could be running rags on corporate websites, on the university websites, to try to fine tune the prompts, the emails, whatever that they're sending to people with real and relevant up-to-time information about people's roles, maybe about things that they've recently published, et cetera, right? So again, these different kind of forms of interaction that are being enabled by these systems are increasingly complex. But what that also means is that it creates multiple kind of choke points and points of potential disruption for different actors in the stack. And that's something that we're interested in. So let me tell you about the book that we're working on and the main research questions, and I think follows fairly naturally from what I've just talking about, which is, okay, if we have this kind of holistic full stack lens that's interested in the behavior of a bunch of different AI companies and intermediaries, and not just what model developers are doing, but actually what the entire, or as close to as entire, as complete as possible, the AI ecosystem involved in potentially malicious activities are doing to govern the behavior of their users, right? And they might be doing this for various ways, for both political and legal reasons. We'll get into it, but there are legacy laws in many jurisdictions that will force and already are forcing AI intermediaries to act on issues like child safety, terrorism, violent extremism, etc. But there's also brand safety and other kinds of issues that these companies are trying to navigate, where certain types of content are just not attractive for them to be linked to, and they are going to have to try to disrupt. So what are the kind of political drivers of the system? What specifically are the companies doing? And what are the trade-offs and tensions that flow out of this? And what can we learn about the history of, or what can we learn about what we think is going to happen going forward when we also draw on the history of platform and internet regulation? And yeah, that leads to the second question, which is a little bit about the trade-offs and problems that we find happen when different intermediaries are called upon to disrupt AI in various ways across the stack. So we'll get into this, but there are freedom of expression, privacy, and security concerns that I think are well worth looking at and thinking about, even if the space is still a little bit speculative or emerging at the moment. Okay, so for the last 15 to 20 minutes or so, I want to tell you about this particular paper that we published last year and kind of has formed the foundation of this book that we've been doing. And it's a deep case study, as far as we know, kind of the first paper to look at the practices of these AI hosting intermediaries that we call model marketplaces. So what are model marketplaces? I don't know if any of you have heard of or have used sites like Hugging Face, but these are online services that allow people to upload or tweak custom models, as well as other AI artifacts, data sets, etc., for others to use. And they're often talked about as kind of part of the open source AI movement. And one of the things that's notable about these platforms, and you probably can't see it because the screenshot is fairly small, but these platforms mix kind of lay user with extremely expert user functionality in various ways that are quite interesting, right? So Hugging Face has become a place where the largest research labs, you can see on the right here, companies like Microsoft, Meta, the Falcon model is up there. This is a screenshot of the top models on Hugging Face as of a year ago, probably with around 300,000. But you also see models uploaded by random people, random researchers, random hobbyists, right? So this is a user-generated content platform where anyone like you and I could just go and create our own model, either from scratch or tune another model and then upload it and put it into the world. And one of the things that it does, which I think is part of their kind of core value proposition, is they're very good at integrating into research and kind of deployment pipelines, and also kind of lowering the barrier to entry for AI use, generative AI use in particular, for lay users, right? So, for example, they have partnered with a lot of infrastructure providers and also have their own infrastructure. So you can go onto one of these models. A lot of them will have what's called a kind of playground environment where you can already, without doing anything, kind of prompt and interact with some of these models. And then you can upload a credit card and one click basically deploy this model into their cloud without really having to write a single line of code or really know anything about what you're doing. But these are general purpose platforms, so you can see in the left toolbar that there's a wide range of different models available, from kind of image classification tasks, feature extraction, to text generation and creation. And yeah, it's a kind of platform that has become, increasingly popular and important in the AI movement. I'm happy to answer questions about this and what the kind of political economy of these companies are. But Hugging Face is probably the largest and best known. There's another one called Kaggle, which I believe has been purchased by Google at some point. We talk a little bit, and I'd be happy to talk more also in the Q&A. There is a bit of a gray line between these kind of very AI-focused platforms that really built in a lot of features for specifically integrating into AI development pipelines and hosting AI artifacts, versus more general software repositories, pages like things like GitHub, GitLab, etc. But at the end of the day, these are, places that host software, and at the end of the day, that's what we think AI systems usually are: complex kind of emergent software. So that's Hugging Face. Another type of platform that we talk about in our paper are more niche model marketplaces that specifically host image generation models. So one of the most popular ones is a site called Civitai. Again, I can't see you all, but if I was in the room, I would ask for a show of hands, or maybe look for some nodding faces to see if anyone is aware of this company and the service. But Civitai is another kind of interesting hybrid social network slash AI model hosting space slash AI infrastructure provider. So it is both a social space where users create accounts and a place where people navigate images in a grid layout, kind of akin to an Instagram or something. But the difference to the Instagram or other social network is that every time you click on one of these images on the main page, you are taken to a kind of detailed generation site where you can see exactly what the creator used to generate this image. So what combination of specific models. They host various different types of models. In the early days, it was particularly stable diffusion versions were particularly prevalent, but I think now they have other ones too. And it also shows the specific prompt and settings that they used to generate the model. And you can see right in the bottom left, right, it says create images like this. So with, a single click at the beginning, it was free. Now they have monetized this. So you, again, upload a credit card, buy some credits, and you can generate images of your own. And again, if Larry Lessig or someone, one of the kind of old school generative technologies, generative software scholars was here in the room, they might say, well, wow, this is like an incredible opportunity to be able to remix content and to bring creators really into media in various ways. And that, of course, is true. And there's plenty of legitimate uses of these kind of image generation models. So you might be asking, okay, why does this matter? And I guess this won't be a shock to those of you that have been online for a long time and know that one of the major uses of the internet quantitatively is for pornography. And that is very much true for these platforms, these image generation platforms in particular. And not only do these services have a massive, porn problem, I mean, that's just one subset. It might not be necessarily a problem, again, depending on your particular stance on consensual pornography, which of course is legal in many, if not all, jurisdictions. But you're also seeing huge numbers of non-consensual pornography, so pornography that's impersonating not just celebrities, mainly women, but also ordinary people, micro celebrities, streamers, random influencers online, as well as child sexual abuse imagery. And we can get into the law on that. In the UK, it's more clear that synthetic child sexual abuse imagery is generally illegal. In the US, it's a little bit less clear as far as I know. It depends on whether the image is depicting a real person or not. But at the end of the day, there have been some journalistic and some preliminary research studies into this platform, Civitai, which up until last year at some point had an open API, so you could actually go and look at this. The majority of content, and maybe even the vast majority of this content on these types of services, and Civitai in particular, is pornography, is sexual in nature of various kinds, right? And it's not just image generation models and image generation hosting platforms that are facing what we might start thinking about as legal liability and content moderation issues. So in the paper, we begin with a story of GPT 4chan, which we think is probably like the first controversy, the first content moderation controversy facing a user-generated, a model hosting service, where a Swiss machine learning researcher, who also happened to be a YouTuber, combined various open resources. So in their case, Eleuther AI's GPT-J model, something similar to ChatGPT, GPT 3.5, with a research data set of posts that have been made in the last 10 years on 4chan's politically incorrect poll board, and basically created a hate speech LLM, which he then plugged into an agent of sorts and had post on 4chan for a few days before turning it off. He made a YouTube video about it, called it an experiment, all very funny, haha, for the lols. But this was also hosted on Hugging Face, and hundreds, maybe even thousands of users download this model. And we're also able to easily interact with this model. Okay, what happens? Is this something that is potentially unsafe? And if so, how should the company make the judgment? How do they kind of determine where the boundaries are? This is a classic work of content moderation. So that was in 2022. And at the time, Hugging Face, despite being a multi-million-dollar company, which was really getting a lot of hype, moving from Paris to New York, attracting significant funding from major companies like Amazon, they didn't have any trust and safety or content moderation staff. This is a screenshot of the CEO of the company, Clément Delague, jumping into kind of text chat associated with each repository to basically say that, hey, IMO, this is pretty bad. If the author should have asked us, we probably would have dissuaded them from uploading this model. But we've had a lot of debate about it, and we're thinking that the model can stay up as long as certain specific changes are made. In the end, they decided, after a little bit more kind of backlash from the AI community, to take down the model entirely. And this, to us, is, I think, a really interesting puzzle of sorts, right? So model marketplaces like Hugging Face, like Civitai, have started developing content policies and are trying to navigate how they should handle different types of prospective harm like this. But it's really not clear. So they say, as Clément said, content should not harm others, right? And the Hugging Face policies now say this. But what does that mean in the context not of a specific image or piece of text or video, but in the context of software that's open-ended, a tool that is dual use and has multiple purposes and can be used in all sorts of different ways? So we look at, in this paper, the different forms of justification that different model marketplaces provide for their moderation decisions, which we show is a kind of mishmash of taking down content based on the intent, So what the researcher or the uploader says that the model should be used for, right? So in this case, okay, maybe okay, because it's apparently ostensibly a research project. The potential for harm, right? Which then is a little bit more complex to weigh. So I guess you could do some kind of value judgment on the model and figure out various thresholds in which you would try to act. And then the third is empirical use, right? So in this case, they're like, oh, we already have examples of this model being used in malicious ways in the real world. So maybe we should take it down. So which one is it? And what we argue in the paper is that various AI intermediaries need to moderate models with certain potential for harm, probably already, due to legal requirements in certain jurisdictions, but also due to reliability and kind of reputational risk. But this is incredibly hard to do well. So now with some citations from UK law, for example, you could make an argument, and again, there isn't case law on this yet, but you could imagine it in the next few years as these kinds of platforms continue to proliferate and AI misuse continues to kind of grow in salience on the public agenda. In the very broad UK terrorism legislation, for example, any kind of information that is potentially useful to a person preparing a terrorist action is likely illegal. And again, this will be, weighed on a case-by-case basis, but the idea is here that like open purpose terror bomb making manuals, for example, could be illegal under this statute, right? Anything that's useful. Similarly, UK child protection law has a statute which talks about what the law refers to as pseudo photographs. So this is any type of material or data that can be converted into indecent images of children. That's the law from the law. The language from the law is itself considered an indecent image of a child. And the logic there, we think, is that you shouldn't be able to encrypt a file, for example, or crop it or kind of make it harder to access and therefore avoid legal liability. So anything that can become an indecent image, a piece of CSAM, therefore is also a piece of CSAM. And of course, this is very difficult for the AI space where not only a lot of large, very large scale open image databases like Leon. Training data sets have been shown by researchers to have considerable numbers of child sexual abuse images already in them, and the ability of many open models, but also proprietary models that generate images to fairly easily create child sexual abuse material. This means that the models themselves, in certain cases, or maybe even in all cases, could be interpreted to fall afoul of the statute. I won't get into it too much here, but there's obviously also data protection issues and liabilities that providers would need to consider or should consider. And there's also the copyright problem, right? How do platforms deal with models that are fine-tuned on specific content from that is copyrighted, or simply can reproduce copyrighted content, which is basically all models. And of course, this is being, legislated right now and kind of debated in the courts. But this is all to say that these are prospective kind of potential for harms that require attention from AI intermediaries. And the problem that we find in the paper is that there's a real question of capacity for firms to do this effectively. And this is part of the crux of our argument in the paper and also in the book, that analyzing AI systems and models for potential illegality or harm is incredibly complicated. And it's not easily automatable, which is a real big problem, I think, for the current paradigm of content moderation, which often involves just throwing more AI at things. So AI tools are complex software. They can be used in a whole bunch of different ways. And the same model, which creates cute onion photos, can also create CSAM or non-consensual intimate imagery. So how should we be dealing with that? How are platforms dealing with that? So that's the second part of the paper. We talk about the various kinds of, I guess, fixes or interventions that platforms have tried to develop. One of those involves using licenses, which they, I guess, soft bind users in various ways. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. But what we're also seeing is yeah, I guess a lack of clarity through licensing, where platforms are receiving, they're starting to get requests from different government actors, including law enforcement, to take models down. So how detailed does the kind of report of harm or flag need to be? Of course, we also know from the content moderation literature that there's a long tradition of people kind of maliciously flagging stuff just to get it removed or censored. So, in our paper, we talk about examples of governments that are trying to remove satirical political satire models. And Hugging Face does that. So, and they remove it globally, and not just in the jurisdiction. So, why is that? And I guess what would a more kind of robust regime look like? So what's also the obligation for investigation and analysis on the platform versus on the notifier, right? So if I flag a model to Hugging Face, so for example, one thing that happened that was reported by 404 Media, a great journalist-run tech site that I'm sure many of you are aware of, Civitai under pressure from various payment providers started dramatically removing significant numbers of non-consensual intimate imagery models in the last 6 months. And a lot of those models were getting downloaded and put onto Hugging Face, right? So if I go to Hugging Face and say, hey, here's this model which depicts me, and it has a high potential of harm because it can be combined with another image generation model that is tuned to create pornography, for example, and I want this model taken down. What's the obligation for kind of investigation and analysis that lies with me in making that claim versus the platform, right? Can I just simply refer this to them and then they go into it? Are they required to actually try to run this model, interact with it, do an audit of it? How should they do that? And how, with what depth? So again, I think this is something that's like potentially requiring a huge amount of work and labor and is not easily automatable and also very open-ended and kind of thorny. And that's also just working under the assumption that all the actors and intermediaries in the space really care and want to get their house in order, if you will. So we also see a kind of classic bad actor problem. So a lot of the platforms, including Civitai in the past, have really failed to act on child sexual abuse imagery. We're already seeing a kind of emergence of regulation-resistant model hosting spaces. There's one called Shogoth, which is built on the BitTorrent protocol, right? So decentralized platforms in different jurisdictions that are specifically designed to avoid removal. So how will actors deal with this, especially when certain platforms are explicitly profiting from malicious behavior? So Civitai, for a while, had this bounty function where people could basically pay money for people to make certain models. And again, maybe you really like cute onions and want to request a special, cute onion creating image model. But most of the uses of this, as far as journalists have reported it, is to create realistic depictions of real people or micro celebrities or Instagram, pages, random people. So again, this is quite worrying. Okay, so I'll wrap up, and that's been quite a lot of detail about this one chapter in the book, which is about what we call model marketplaces, and we're also interested in other layers of the stack. And I'm happy to answer questions about this, what different cloud providers are doing in terms of abuse detection, what could be done in terms of local hardware providers, and that, of course, is where things are getting really hairy and getting a little bit more into the realm of almost client-side scanning, where if you're really in a world where government actors are putting pressure on hardware providers to not allow, for example, people to run, models that impersonate people on their local device. What would you actually have to do? What kind of various OS monitoring and other forms of filtering would you have to embed into devices? What are all the security and privacy concerns? Again, this is also something we're interested in. But basically, just to sum up, the point of the book and the point of this paper is that intermediaries are playing a bigger role in facilitating access to AI apps and services, especially in the kind of open space, and therefore also interacting with malicious uses as a result. This is another question, and we could talk about this in the Q&A. These actors don't really fall into the scope of current regulation. in the EU or beyond. So this is a potential problem, although of course this is starting to change a little bit too. And yeah, we think that these different players are going to become a regulatory choke point in case in very ways there already are. And this has implications for rights, for privacy. Are we going to head into a kind of almost security DRM space where only whitelisted models should be run on local hardware? Again, what would that fight look like? How is it going to play out? These are the kinds of things we're interested in. So yeah, here's the paper. Please check it out if you're interested. And yeah, I'm just really happy to be here, and I'm curious for your questions.
Hey, thank you so much, Rob. That's just mind-blowing. I'm a big fan of this paper. And by the way, I just dropped the paper URL in the chat. So if folks want to go and have a look at the papers, it's a long, technical in a way, but also fascinating piece of writing. I think I assume that lots of people have questions, but if I may, I will abuse my position of chair to make two questions. And I see that Clara, PhD student here in Manchester that just started, is in the audience. So I think there's one question that Clara, two questions that Clara and I'm her supervisor, that we've been thinking about when we think about the moderation of AI, even if you think about the models, right, or market models, as you said. So the first thing is, what struck me from in the beginning of your presentation is just the complexity of this, right? So platforms, as we understood them before, they were quite complex by the sheer amount of people on platforms, but the system itself tend to be, it's sort of a very concentrated, or a very unequal form of system, right? So literally someone in Palo Alto didn't want, if they decided that, we shouldn't talk about Palestine, they could just press a button. And of course, with some problems and major sort of spillovers, that more or less would happen, right? But now we're talking about like a system that's way more diffuse, as you said in the beginning, way more fragmented. And so my first question regards the complexity of this, right? So one, how do you make empirical sense of this complexity? How do you research this, right? If you have so many organizations associated with this, and if you will, not, but also how you theorize this level of complexity, right? So that's my sort of first two questions were about the complexity, how to research, how to theorize. The second one is something that I think you and I actually had a brief conversation about this, which is the possibility that AI models are uncontrollable, right? So that regardless of sort of the technical sophistication of companies, the way essentially how probability works means that if you have a really malicious actor and they know how to, prompt inject, that if they know exactly how to jailbreak, they will be able to do whatever they want with the system. So yeah, so how should we approach uncontrollability in the context of those systems?
Mm. They're both really interesting questions, Joao. Thank you. And complex ones, to be honest, that I'm still working through and I don't have clear answers for. But I'll start maybe with the first one. And I think I hinted, I guess, at the very beginning, right, that this is the first time that I feel really deeply kind of pulled into I guess, the intersection of platforms and AI, right? And for a long time, I kind of dismissed a lot of the AI hype, but also, I guess, the kind of resulting issues that were coming out of AI models for various reasons, right? And part of it was, I guess, yeah, I thought that like, okay, these models can do some stuff. It's somewhat impressive. But even if we think about like the early DALL-E models, right, where they were like the most mind-blowing thing this can generate is like a sofa shaped like an avocado or whatever. And it really didn't seem that significant. So I think a combination of the fact that these things are getting more powerful and more potentially useful and the fact that now that it's just becoming so much of a complex ecosystem, and there's so many model providers, and there's all this open stuff, which is what we're really focusing on, right? Because of course you could write an entire other book on what OpenAI is doing. And I think it would be really valuable to basically just go and interview these people, right? And this is something we wanted to do initially, but we realized that before we had to do that, we had to a bit like lay out the terrain, lay out some of the techniques, right? So I think in a fundamental, like we kind of know what is possible, right? In terms of what the companies can do. Of course, we don't know precisely what their motivations are, how exactly they balance different values and different things. But we know that, okay, if you have this open-ended model, and it's exactly like you said, it's to a degree ungovernable in the sense that once the model has been released, it's incredibly expensive and difficult to make adjustments to it. And if it's not an environment that is platformized, where like, the ChatGPT or Gemini app, where they can constantly be kind of, tweaking everything, right? It's like the ultimate of what I think Tarleton Gillespie used to say of that, like everything on the platform is platformized. Now it's like that times 1,000. So everything, the specific interface of the app, the system prompts could be changed on, we have no idea, right? It could be changed on geolocation. It could be targeted to users. It could be, changed up to due to policy updates every day, right? We know so, but we know that's happening. We also know there's a lot of filters that are happening, right? And I guess, the thing that I'm interested in. So on one hand, maybe just to riff on your first question, the question of like centralization versus decentralization of power in this space as a governance ecosystem, I think is really interesting. And I guess part of it comes down to in the grand scheme of things, how many people are actually going to be using, for example, OpenAI models versus like how much market concentration will there be? And of course, if there's a lot of market concentration, what they do is very salient. Um, but on the other hand, if people are using other models, right, that are locally tweaked or tweaked for specific language needs or regional, etc., you're also getting these kind of weird stackified governance dynamics, which I think are really brittle and complex. So I don't really know how to research or think about it yet, but there's a lot of weird stuff going on. So just to like riff on your Palestine point, there was a really interesting blog post that came out over the summer by a person who I think was at the Singapore National University, who's a librarian, who said, hey, our university has started getting all these subscriptions for these AI powered research services. And all of these services like ProQuest, um, Scopus are starting to bundle AI search into them. And they are building filters into it, which they are getting from Microsoft. And that he was able to find that Microsoft's content safety, or this was at least his argument, you could not search any dissertations that mention Gaza, for example, right? Probably because it's been flagged as potentially toxic by some weird classifier that is being, provided by some intermediary down the stack. So yeah, I guess, we're getting, I think, also a lot of brittleness and a lot of points of failure. And other than just to think about it in the mode we are now, which is like, there's a lot of weird stuff happening. We want to write about it. We want to try to understand it, at least in a superficial way. I don't know. We just got to keep documenting and chipping away and hopefully telling also through these kinds of stories and anecdotes something that starts painting a more holistic picture and sets the ground up for more robust kind of empirical research going forward. But sorry, I know that was a kind of long answer, but you did give me
No,
four
no.
questions.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, so maybe it was unfair. And anyway, but so we have several people here lined up. Maybe Alexandra. I'm just seeing here the people in my visually the first one that came to.
Do we have to stop at the top of the hour, or do we have a bit of extra time?
No, I think we can go for like 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, Alexandra, if you want to, you can just say your question.
So there might be, if it's Alexandra Sarov, there's a question already in the chat.
All right. Okay.
What do you think will be the most significant AI stack in the next 10 years? And for infrastructure security in particular. Yeah, so this is, I mean, I would rephrase this in a way that is kind of parsimonious and understandable to me, which is, I guess, trying to think about the different layers of the stack and which one will be most important in terms of a governance kind of perspective, right? If you're trying to disrupt certain types of behavior. And I think maybe to cop out, part of the answer will be that it kind of depends on what specifically you're trying to disrupt, what kind of action. If it's fraud that's based on LLMs versus stuff that's image generated, that is going to be kind of involving different actors and different models. Um, I think potentially, I guess this slightly worries me, um, but there's a trend. So now I'm jumping to like kind of classic internet regulation, right? But there used to be this argument made, and I think it might be called the end-to-end principle, where, if you think about the stack in a slightly different way that we're thinking about it, which is in terms of the kind of internet stack of different protocols and technologies, the idea was that you wanted to kind of bake governance in, not deep in the stack, but more on the edges, right? So that this should be flexible and customizable, and people should be able to make decisions on how these tools work for their needs as they wish, right? So you shouldn't have content filtering at like the protocol level, at the DNS level, or at the, I guess, like HTTP or whatever, TCP packet switching level. You do control kind of on the web level, right? Of course, what we've seen now is that more and more has been kind of platformized and pulled into like the platforms ecosystems that sit right on top of that stack in places like Facebook. But what I think is happening here is that arguably, because of what you said, Joao, of this kind of inherent ungovernability and dual use nature, the fact that, for example, okay, if you have some model that is really, really worrisome and problematic, and okay, it's shared on Hugging Face, and someone removes it, that model can still exist in the world and can still be used locally on people's devices. So I think the kind of concern, especially from a privacy perspective, will be that a lot of this stuff goes deeper and deeper into the stack and goes onto our end devices, right? And again, I think that just needs to be done really carefully, and in a way that is privacy preserving, if possible, right? I mean, some of those things are not going to be possible to do in a privacy preserving way. But yeah, I guess we'll see. I think local hardware potentially being a big place of kind of contestation, and also probably the cloud. Because as models maybe, I don't know if the trend is going to continue towards kind of more and more compute and more powerful, but that's where a lot of activity is kind of happening. But yeah, maybe just one quick comment on this too. What I think is interesting, and I didn't talk about the cloud stuff too much, but part of the problem, right? So I guess we're kind of starting to get interested in like the grammar of governance or something, and the specific logics that are in the space that make it weirder than the classic kind of AI space or the classic platform space. So one other thing is that just like there's not a lot of observability and not a lot of visibility into a lot of behavior. Stuff is hard to analyze. And stuff also, it's difficult at a large scale to distinguish legitimate from illegitimate uses. So if you're a cloud provider like Azure, where because you're trying to earn money, you have kind of created this almost like, no click model deployment pipeline, kind of AI as a service pipeline, which allows people to run open source models on your infrastructure in the cloud. And you allow them to run image generation models, which have a lot of problems with creating illegal content, like maybe like stable diffusion. Um, you know, First of all, are you now looking at the images created by every single client you have? Are you just looking at the ones that are individuals and not on kind of commercial licenses, right? Where you often might have contracts which kind of prevent you, for reasons of corporate secrecy, to look at what the activity of these things is. Something we've been researching in that case is that there's already been some really interesting cases um, of something like cloud jacking, where people are hacking big companies' cloud credentials and then using those to generate illicit material, for example, child sexual abuse imagery, for free, with the bill going to this other company. And the problem, unlike cryptojacking, right, which was a big problem for the cloud industry, and they've had to build kind of abuse monitoring systems to detect again, there isn't inherently anything, if someone is careful in covering their tracks, between an account that is, generating images and an account that's generating images. It's not like you have a huge spike in server activity like you did in the crypto space, right? So it's possible that some of this stuff is very difficult, if not impossible, to detect. And really, I think that's one of the things that is kind of keeping us up or interesting us right now, is a challenge that I think the trend in the space, if companies are going to really care about doing this work well, which again is a huge if, right? The trend is towards more expertise, more labor, more kind of manual investigation, more kind of threat intelligence, close analysis, looking for certain suspicious accounts, maybe even in other places off the platform, coordinating with other companies. That's something we're seeing in the child safety space, but not more widely. And of course, that is not something that is really like the mode du jour right now, right? If anything, the trend is going the other way, where the trend is fewer resources, more AI. We don't have to do trust and safety anymore because it's woke. And governments are not going to be able to force us to do it. So I think that's just like a really weird and interesting dynamic.
Okay, so maybe Patrick, I'm not sure if you want to say, yeah, no,
Yep,
it's
thank
Patrick.
you. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, so regulation, you said might come in directly addressing AI models, and there are some laws that already apply to these models and like AI content, as you said. But do you know if there are any actual government regulators to enforce these laws, or is it all up to the companies? And if it is there any proof that they've been doing this or have any motivation to do this? And like using a more kind of everyday example, which is slightly unrelated to AI model bases and is more about the AI content. But like one of the few, you talked about the problem of centralized, the internet's not very centralized, but one of the few centralized places on the internet is YouTube, for example. And when you're scrolling through YouTube, you can see an insane amount of like AI ads about some fake product or some weird sexualized stuff. And are they liable for hosting these ads? Like, is there anything? Yeah, our company's liable, basically.
Hmm. Yeah, so really, really, really good question. Thank you, Patrick. So maybe just quickly, I mean, the short answer to the regulation piece is like no. Um, but this is starting to change, right? So the one regulator that I know that has actually created a code, um, which pertains to these model providers, for example, and they're very interested in kind of AI supply chain issues, is the Australian E-Safety Commissioner. And we actually presented this paper to them, and they have apparently been doing some stuff with it. Um, the NTIA, the National Telecom and Information Administration in the US, was also working on a kind of code of conduct, which would have been voluntary, but this would have been something, that was before the Trump 2 administration, so that's all been scrapped. And I also hear that there's been lots of back and forth on like the EU AI Act and trying to get different intermediaries within the scope of that, because right now it's just deployers and developers and not really anyone in the middle. But yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be it's tricky, right? This is still an emerging space. Um, there was a question in the chat about the kind of history of internet regulation, and Australia there is an interesting question because they have had historically a lot of trouble with getting intermediaries outside of their jurisdiction to do takedowns, for example, right? So they have under their Online Safety Act and even the prior frameworks, they had liabilities that they could leverage, but that was not extraterritorial. And I need to read the law again. They've been flexing their muscles in various ways with for example, Abhorrent Violent Material Act and other kind of updates to the criminal code. So they've been trying to make these apply with criminal liability to firms in various ways. Again, that's hard to enforce if the platforms don't have they don't have any kind of boots on the ground, if you will. But I think this is definitely something that regulators are getting a little bit more interested in. So we'll see how it plays out. I mean, the second part is, I guess, courts, right, and private suits and things, right, which feasibly could happen. So we'll still see. I mean, again, the US is a bit of a lost cause because of their very broad kind of immunity protections. But it seems to me, right, that if someone was to sue a platform like Civitai, which literally has like a bounty function, they call it a bounty, and it's to create like a bounty, a model impersonating a specific person, you could maybe make a legal argument that they're going beyond just being a mere host and they're, more active participants or publishers in this information. So there could be legal liability. But I think the last thing you mentioned is really interesting too, about just like, I guess, governance and regulatory capacity and how that's missing even on a lot of major centralized platforms, right? So YouTube, you mentioned. Another one that we've gotten really interested in is the App Store, right? So Apple App Store, for example, which you think is like the perfect example for, for doing thoughtful moderation, because they do a proactive review, right? So there's a period of usually, I think, 2 weeks that has to pass before your app that you submit is allowed onto the store. It's not a post and then take down model. It's a allow list model, right, where they're reviewing stuff. So it's very interesting that even this model has a huge amount of Nudify apps slipping through the cracks, right? And not just, and I mean, there's some ones that are more interesting in the sense that they're more subtle. So something that has been reported is, for example, that people are kind of getting through the app review process by just making general purpose like AI drawing apps or image editor apps, but then those are being marketed off platform, like on other parts of the web, maybe on YouTube, but on porn sites, other places, as kind of Nudify non-consensual image apps. But there's other apps, like when I was looking over the summer at the App Store, you just see overtly sexual AI image apps that clearly could be used for NCII stuff, and they have gotten through the app review. So why? How is that the case? And of course, that's where you get the political economy and the political will question, right? So Apple, I mean, there's some interesting reporting coming out now out of this whole ice block saga, right? This app that was just removed from the App Store. It's getting a little bit of attention, but as far as I know, there's only one paper to have been published about App Store moderation, but we don't really know much about how many people do this work, how much time do they have, how automated versus manual it is, how much expertise do these people have, right? Because again, apps are also dual use software, and it's just hard to understand how a software system might work, and to kind of basically conduct a full kind of, safety or objectable content audit of the app. So yeah, weird space. And I think, just it'll be interesting to see how platforms respond, especially if they start facing more pressure from different stakeholders.
All right.
Clarifying.
So
Thank you.
yeah, thanks, Patrick. So maybe Rob, do you want to answer a little bit more the question on the history of internet regulation, or we can wrap up? It's up to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're still working on this. I would say if anything, more like it's more that our sensibility is kind of inspired or approached through this lens on the history of internet regulation, right? So we're writing a lot about stuff, and also just history of kind of techno regulation, if you want to use that word more generally, right? So the ways to encode rules and boundaries into different kinds of technical systems. So in our book, we have all sorts of weird, we write a lot about spam, but we're also interested in like how different cities are trying to govern drones, right? Like commercial drones, and putting GPS blockers that they get the different providers to agree to be able to sell into the market, these kinds of things. But yeah, I think, the first most obvious point is basically that there's a lot of platforms here and there's a lot of intermediaries that potentially have power, and we think they will be forced to do stuff because it's a classic story, right? So if you are a powerful stakeholder or an interest group and you really want something to change or to come down, you will kind of work across the stack, I think, and go at different players, whether it's payment intermediaries, which is not something we really talk about because they're not really involved in the actual generation of content. But of course, they're an important player, especially in kind of illicit spaces, to other types of platforms that are going to get involved. So obviously, app stores are starting to get pressure. Model developers are getting pressure, building more filtering in. Model marketplaces are seeing pressure. So, yeah, I think we're kind of trying to just look at it in this long-term perspective, and also see that this isn't necessarily a new problem, right? I think there are some new and weird dynamics in terms of how dual use and open-ended this is. This is kind of like really the ultimate open generative software governance problem. But it's also a story old as time, which is like people do bad stuff with computers and technologies, and then it gets made in a public way, and then people try to push back and either get that stuff removed, get other players to make it more difficult to produce that content or spread it, or also then maybe even redesign some of these systems to introduce friction. So that's a word which I haven't used yet, I think, but that's kind of a key part of the story, which is, okay, this is maybe impossible to govern perfectly, but can you add enough friction, right? Our players are trying to add enough friction to make it harder for basically everyone except the most motivated people. So we'll see how that plays out, right? Again, it's much more difficult now, even in a kind of closed box AI tool like a ChatGPT app or a Gemini, to get it to create CSAM for you, right? It's very difficult. You have to be quite good at doing prompt engineering, et cetera, et cetera. So, when they first released them, they didn't really think about a lot of these issues, and it was, all sorts of non-consensual pornography with people holding signs that said "fuck Microsoft" being created by Microsoft apps. So there's zero filtering or guardrails, and now, of course, it's becoming more, a little bit more police, a little bit more complex to navigate. But yeah, I think still these systems are imperfect. Obviously, they come with knock-on effects, and they're going to fail in a lot of interesting ways, which I think we should be kind of attentive to.
All right, perfect. I think that's it. Thank you again, Rob, and thanks everyone for coming